The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Charles Christian, and you're listening to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. And we start with a bit of news. It's about a cave in the UK area of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. It's on the borders there. It's called Creswell Crags. It's a limestone gorge, and it's recently been discovered that there are not dozens but hundreds of symbols used to ward off the evil eye and misfortune. And it's the largest ever collection of these found in the UK, all in one place. Experts believe they were intended as protection against witches and curses. And Paul Baker, who's the director of the Creswell Heritage Trust, said the marks had been in plain sight and people knew they were there, but we'd been told they were Victorian graffiti. We had no idea of their original origins. They were spotted by a couple of cavers and alerted experts on the subject, including Alison Fern, who's at Leicester University, and she's an expert on protective marks of this nature. They take the form of overlapping V's, referring to the Virgin Mary, and there are also PMs, as in Pace Maria, once again referring to the Virgin Mary, crossed eyes, which is basically Jesus on the cross, and a number of odd-shaped A's, which so far, nobody's actually given an explanation for what they're there for. Alison Fern says they date from the 16th to 19th century, and although they are Christian in origin, it's not necessarily linked with religion. She says it's the equivalent today of crossing your fingers or saying, "Oh my God," rather than it actually being a specific invocation to a deity. She adds what the marks were intended to keep out or keep in can only be speculated on. It could be fairies, it could be witches, whatever you were fearful, what was going on down in those caves. Another interesting little element is that the village of Creswell originally was much closer to the caves, these being medieval and late medieval through to 19th century markings. However, in the mid-19th century, the Dukes of Portland, who owned the area, relocated the village 20 minutes walk away. So it makes sense that these were from way back then. And of course, as we all know about caves and the like, they were for many years regarded as a place where supernatural, untamed, non-human forces might live. And indeed, it's noticeable that Creswell Crags has the distinction of being the first location in the UK where Ice Age cave art, including pictures of birds and deer, bisons and horses, has ever been discovered. That was only 15 years ago they were discovered. So, Creswell Crags, gateway to hell or some kind of place to prevent evil seeping out into the world? On with the show. And here's Janie, who's got a couple of stories for us. One's about a miraculous cure and one's about a ghostly haunting.
Yes, healing waters.
Ooh.
Yes, we have them in this country. Mm-hmm. Well, in Scotland, we have Loch and it's a legend. Apparently, on the first Mondays of February, May, August and November, if you enter on these certain days of the year, the waters of this loch chilly, obviously, would heal the sick on the proviso that the loch was entered 3 times at midnight, even chillier, obviously, and the water then sipped, disgusting, before a silver coin was thrown in. Now we're getting to it, yeah. The sick would then have to leave the site before the sun came up, presumably, and before they started to throw up, having
drunk the water.
Drunk the mucky water.
It seems a bit, if you're sick, it seems quite a lot to get yourself up to a loch at midnight, climb in and out of it 3 times, and then stagger off.
Kill or cure.
Well,
obviously.
Yes.
Then we're down in Norfolk.
Oh.
North Reps.
North Reps.
That's kind of North Norfolk.
It is.
Where it's all quite weird. Shrieking Pit is the name of the water. And it's along a lane off of Hungry Hill, just to get the atmosphere right. Now, it happens on the 4th of February, 24th of February. I was getting a bit overexcited. Some do say that the entity that appears in the pit is the spirit of a woman who took her life, while others believe it's something much darker that lures the unwary to their deaths. At nearby North Reps, which is just south of the wonderfully named Hungry Hill, as I just mentioned, is a track which leads to several tree-shrouded and water-filled hollows, which bear the name of the Shrieking Pits. And it's named after a wailing woman whose change of heart after a suicide attempt fell on deaf ears. So, this is what happened. It's said that about midnight on February the 24th, the spirit of a village girl named Esmeralda appears between the vale of the living and the dead. That's all terribly sad. At the age of 17, Esmeralda had fallen in love with a wealthy but untrustworthy young farmer, who conducted a secret relationship with her behind his wife's back. Double boo. The local vicar discovered the affair and ordered them to draw it to a close. So the farmer skulked back to his wife and, without a word from her sweetheart, poor Esmeralda's heart broke. She drifted into misery and depression and was unable to forget her love. So, on a frosty February night, she was wandering the lanes close to the village when she came upon the pit, and in a moment of desperation, she threw herself in. Almost immediately she regretted a hasty decision and called for help, but none came and she perished. Her desperate screams can still be heard on February the 24th, adding an extra chill to a winter's night. The pits, in case you were wondering, are believed to be early medieval in origin and created by digging for iron ore to be used in smelting. So that's what they were for. So they're probably quite deep. But yes, poor lady. Now, you see, she'd go on Facebook, wouldn't she?
She would.
And she'd go, do you know what that low-life piece of rubbish has done to me? And everybody would say, kick him to the curb.
Yep.
He's not worth it.
Yep.
Dump his arse. Sorry, can I say that?
Yes.
Okay.
You just have.
Yeah.
And go on daytime TV.
Yeah.
And she'd probably end up getting on a reality TV show.
Possibly.
Be on
which
Love
would have been a
Island.
lot better than sinking to the bottom of a freezing pit.
Exactly.
Yes, but they didn't have it then. So there we are. So that's all I have on water's healing and not so healing.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Something wicked this way comes. Weird Harvest Press presents Harvest Hymns, the sweet fruits and twisted roots of folk horror. A 2-volume set of books investigating the music of folk horror, featuring contributions from some of the biggest names in the field. Candia McCormack, Johnny Trunk, Maddie Pryor, Sharon Krause, Jim Jupp and Kemper Norton, to name just a few. Available now via lulu.com. 100% of all Weird Harvest Press profits are donated to wildlife charities.
Welcome, fool. have come of your own free will to the appointed place. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man. The Wicker Man.
Let's have some diary dates. We've had a story already about witchcraft. So here's good news for all fans of Wicca and witchcraft. Aren't we all? As Witchfest International has just announced it's returning to its traditional UK home of the Fairfield Halls in Croydon and will be coming there again on the 9th of November this year, 2019. The official announcement goes on to say that with a freshly refurnished building and additional space available, it will be bigger and better than ever before. Witchfest and Fairfield have a long history, so we hope you are as pleased with the move as we are. We'll miss Brighton, which is where Witchfest has been for the last few years. It'll always be our second home, but we're looking forward to being back in Croydon, and we've already started booking speakers and entertainers. Speakers booked already include Professor Ronald Hutton, who needs no introduction to anybody interested in paganism and the history of witchcraft. Maxine Saunders, one of the leading lights of the witchcraft movement in the 1960s and 1970s, plus Pete Jennings and Rachel Patterson. Bands that have been booked include the Dolmen, Damn the Bard, that's with an H on the end, not an N, and the Medieval Babes. For more details, check out www.witchfest.net/events. And going even further ahead to next February, when it is the next celebration of Imbolc, or Imbolc if you like to pronounce the B in it. This is the early spring fire festival. And here's an interesting one. Out in the village of Marsden, which is on the A62 between Manchester and Huddersfield, out on Saddlemouth Moor. They have now started running a 2-yearly end of winter festival. And the next occurrence of that festival, which, looking at pictures from last year's one, involves lots of people in hoods and rather frightening masks marching around, fireworks, bonfires and the like. The next date for that is it'll be the 1st of February 2020. It's almost like a version of the Wicker Man, except for nobody gets burned in a large wicker man. So, fans of Imbolc, check out Marsden, West Yorkshire, 1st of February next year.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
I recently had the pleasure of being interviewed by the Russian TV channel Ren TV on a topic of folklore and urban legends, and the topics we discussed, Bonnie and Clyde, and the supposedly fairy tale of Bluebeard. The woman on the other end is Olga from Moscow, which sounds a bit implausible, but no, that was her name. And after that, we go on to talk about Bluebeard. However, the interview there covers a lot of topics that doesn't quite lend itself for this show. So instead, I'll be talking about the background to Bluebeard, his origins, and some historical characters who may have actually been the inspiration in a little separate piece. I know you're thinking to yourselves, that's what the Russians are interested in? American gangsters and European serial killers?
Okay, so who is Bluebeard?
First written by Charles Perrault and published in 1697, so it's quite an ancient story. Now, essentially Bluebeard, a rather ugly man with a large bushy beard, but he was wealthy. He was a member of the aristocracy, so had blue blood, hence the term Bluebeard, as opposed to some kind of dyeing effect on his beard. Bluebeard was a powerful nobleman who'd been married several times to beautiful women who'd all mysteriously vanished. And so it came that he married his next young bride, and shortly after they were married, he gave her the keys of his chateau and said she is able to open any of the doors in the house with them, each of which contains some of his riches, except for an underground chamber which he strictly forbids her to enter, lest she suffers his wrath, although he has given her the keys, including the key to the mystery chamber. You'll not be surprised to know that after he goes on a journey, leaving the house and the keys in her hands, she invites her sister Anne and some friends over for a party, but eventually is overcome with desire to see what the forbidden room holds, so sneaks away from the party and ventures into the room. She opens the door and discovers it's full of blood, and there hanging on the walls are the murdered corpses of all Bluebeard's former wives, hanging up on hooks on the wall. Horrified, as she would be, she drops the key into the blood on the floor and rushes away, and then remembers she's left the key there and the door open, so she goes back and retrieves the key, locks the door, but she can't wash the blood from the key. It's a magical key, of course. She tells the awful secret to her sister, and they both decide that they'll flee the next morning. Yeah, that old, we'll sleep on it and leave the next morning. What could possibly go wrong? Except, of course, first thing in the morning, Bluebeard unexpectedly returns and finds the bloody key. In a blind rage, he threatens to kill her on the spot. And she asks for one last prayer with her sister. But at the very last moment, very conveniently, the brothers of the wife and her sister Anne arrive and they kill Bluebeard. So the wife inherits his fortune, has all the dead wives decently buried. We've mentioned this before. It's quite a big thing in medieval and early modern times that people get a proper burial. And she uses her fortune to help her family get married, marries a man she loves, and generally moves on with her life. Now, needless to say, there are Freudian implications in the story. There are always Freudian implications in fairy tales. The blood and the key having sexual connotations. Key, man, unlocking a woman, etc. But there is also another element to the story, and that it's not really a horror story about a serial killer. No, you'll be surprised to know it's actually a cautionary tale for young married women that basically says, do what your husband tells you, dear, or something really horrible might happen to you. I know, it's the modern world. No one would get away with that nowadays, but, we are talking about events that happened 300 plus years ago. So can't really judge the morals of the story by modern standards. But another question is, where did the story of Bluebeard come from? What was the model for it? Who dreamt up the idea? One of the most popular suggestions is it was the model for Bluebeard, the inspiration, was a French nobleman of the early 15th century. He lived circa AD 1405 to 1440, called Gilles de Rais. He was a baron, he was a leader of the French army, he was a companion of Joan of Arc, and he led the French in many successful battles against the English. However, sometime after the death of Joan of Arc, he appears to, with hindsight, probably had a nervous breakdown, or a midlife crisis. We first hear of him squandering a huge amount of his money on a play he put on. It had 140 speaking parts and 500 extras. It was actually based on the siege of New Orleans, so it was a fairly epic story. And as I say, he nearly bankrupted himself, not least because there were over 600 costumes that had to be manufactured, and unlimited supplies of food and drink were made available both to the cast and the spectators. Shortly after that, he seems to have got involved in the occult, and he contacted the services of a couple of priests, one called Eustache Blanchet and the other one Francois Prelati, and they apparently knew all about alchemy and demon summoning, and they also had some magical books, grimoires, and Gilles de Rais tried a number of experiments in his dungeons at his castle to try and summon up a demon. But in fact, no demon manifested itself, but he did end up spending quite a lot of money on it. The end of his story comes when he is accused of being a serial killer. In fact, he confessed everything without even resorting to torture, and basically he preyed on children and young boys and young men. Their age was between 6 and 18, say mainly boys. He sexually abused them and then murdered them, and in some instances hacked their bodies to pieces and generally gloated and revelled in the blood and gore. Their bodies were then burned. Depending on who you believe, he was responsible for between 80 and 200 murders, although some people say it was as much as 600. Anyway, he confessed, and in the year 1440, on the 26th of October, he was executed. For those who like the gory details, he was hanged and then burned, although in his case he was only burned a little bit, and 4 ladies of rank, they described, claimed the charred body and took it off for burial. His henchmen, who were also involved, they were just left to burn to ashes and scattered to the 4 winds. So, thoroughly unpleasant person. But did he do it? Ever since, there's been quite a lot of controversy. One element is this was during a period where the Kingdom of France was trying to consolidate its borders and was in a dispute over the Duchy of Brittany, and Gilles de Rais was a leading noble from Brittany. So there is a suggestion that framing him for the murders may be a good way of getting him out of the way so all his territories could be seized by the French crown. And, of course, yes, he confessed to the crimes, but as we know, people still to this day confess committing crimes that they didn't do and suffer the consequences of it. So as I say, it does look as if somewhere along in his early middle age, the poor man had a nervous breakdown or some sort of mental relapse into mental illness. But there's even more theories about it, as both Margaret Murray, who is best known nowadays for the book The Witch Cult in Western Europe, and Aleister Crowley, who anybody listening to this show should need no introduction to, they say he was the male equivalent of Joan of Arc. His only crime was the pursuit of knowledge. Margaret Murray goes on to say he was a martyr to a pre-Christian pagan religion, and it was all a big stitch-up. He wasn't a lapsed Catholic who descended into crime and depravity. He was framed for his views. So a bit of a mystery over Gilles de Rais, but it does also raise a question of, well, there's nothing really in his story that links with Bluebeard, because the bodies weren't discovered in Gilles de Rais' castle. They weren't his brides, they weren't women, and Bluebeard actually married his victims and then murdered them, whereas if we accept that Gilles de Rais was a serial killer, he just did horrible things to his victims and killed them. So they're probably not. However, there is another suggestion. There's another suggestion that he may have actually been connected with the story of an early Breton, we're talking Brittany again, king called Connemore the Accursed. And he was a historical character who lived sometime in the late Roman period, what we nowadays call, well, we used to call the Dark Ages, sometime in the 5th or 6th century, so in 500 AD onwards. He married a lady called Tryphene, French name, and she was warned by the ghosts of his previous wives that he murders them when they become pregnant, which was rather bad news for the new Tryphene because she was pregnant. And so she fled for her life, but unfortunately Connemore, the accursed, caught her and beheaded her. Whereupon a saint came along called St. Gildas, who miraculously restored her to life. He then causes Connemore to approach the wall of his castle, which falls upon him and kills him. He's also meant to have killed Saint Tryphene's son, another saint called Saint Tremeur. But here's an interesting little twist in it, because King Connemore is also identified with King Mark, who is one of the characters in the Arthurian legends. He is Sir Tristan's uncle. He is a bit of a villain. It's said that he had horse's ears and had long hair which covered them, and the only people who knew his secret of his ears were his barbers who cut his hair and looked after his hair, and they unfortunately only got the gig once because he murdered them, so they would never reveal his secret. And I say, in the Arthurian legends, and there's a number of versions of it, he rather foolishly sends young Tristan off to collect a beautiful woman who is to be his wife. Her name is Iseult. Sadly, due to a bit of a mix-up with some magic potion, which often happens in medieval legends, Tristan falls in love with Iseult, and he ends up having an affair with her after she's married King Mark. King Mark's not very happy about this, so depending on the version, he either kills Tristan and Iseult, or they escape and live happily ever after. So there we go, very quickly from the fairy tale of Bluebeard to one of the characters in King Arthur by way of French serial killers and a possible very early Breton serial killer called King Connemore, who may have also been King Mark of Cornwall.
So, Bonnie and Clyde, I need just very shortly your ideas. Why did this story become so popular? Because it wasn't really a romantic story, but it was made by journalists and writers and so on. So, what's your idea? Why it became so popular?
Well, I suppose one element is the fact that during their criminal career, Bonnie, the woman, did engage with the media and, didn't have social media, but she was sending poems and pictures and stories to the newspapers, and it struck a nerve with people at the time. This was the time of the Great Depression in America, when banks were going bust, farmers were being thrown off their land, there was huge droughts, and the people of the time thought, the system's against them. Here's somebody who's standing up against it. And then more recently, there was the movie made in 1967, and that gave it a huge boost. That was a huge cult movie. Again, it coincided with the era of the 1960s and counterculture revolution, and The Vietnam War was going on in America. And again, this is people standing up against an authoritarian, uncaring society and fighting for their own turf. So I think it's, that movie was 50 years ago, which is longer than the time between when Bonnie and Clyde were actually active and the movie was made, and it's kept it alive. So when people think of gangsters, the most famous one is Al Capone, because so many stories were told about him. But then Bonnie and Clyde come up there as this sort of romantic anti-heroes, and we tend to gloss over the fact that they killed people, that they were seen as the small people fighting against a big uncaring society that was against them.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
If you want to grow your business, save time using the latest tech, and look great online, Weird Appeal Digital can help. We have a free, yes, that's free download listing 40 digital tools, apps and resources to help you grow your brand, promote your project, generate leads and reach your audience. Just go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales for smart, effective digital design, and your free download. Go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales.
Well, that's it. Almost time for us to go. But before we do, as ever, going to squeeze in one last story. And it's about a place called the Swan Inn at Sybil Headingham, in the village of Sybil Headingham in Essex. And it's the Swan Inn is located near a stream, and it's the scene of the last recorded instance of the swimming of a suspected witch. The concept of swimming was that you would throw a witch into the water, water being the element of baptism, which would reject a witch. Guilt was considered to be proved if the suspect floated, and innocent if the suspect sank, which is a little unfortunate because that usually meant they drowned, so they were going to be hanged if they floated and they were going to be drowned if they didn't float. Anyway, what's surprising about this is that the last swimming was in 1863. Yes, only 150 years ago, when an 80-year-old deaf mute, nicknamed Old Dummy, people were not very politically correct in those days, was accused by Mrs. Smith of casting a spell which had made her ill. Villagers dragged the old man, who'd been enjoying a beer in the bar of the Swan, and threw him in the stream. And there he was left to his fate. He struggled in the water as villagers threw stones at him. But eventually some villagers took pity on him and hauled him out. He died several days later in the local workhouse. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smith and a man named Stammers were charged with manslaughter, largely on the evidence of a young child. Both were found guilty and given sentences in 1864 of 6 months hard labour. Doesn't sound a lot, but hard labour was hard labour in those days. Swimming, eh? Right, well, thank you very much for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time. But until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.